This is Suzane von Richthofen, and she's taken and passed an exam to be a clerk at the Court of Justice in Sao Paulo, Brazil. With such competitive competition for the high-paying role, it's a reason to smile. But for the rest of the country, it's a reason to feel shock, horror, and disgust. Because just 20 years ago, Suzane brutally masterminded the murder of her loving, hardworking parents. And now, as of 2024, she's essentially walking free, steps away from holding a position where she will be in charge of helping the system that upholds the city's moral code. This is the story of Suzane von Richthofen, the infamous Brazilian criminal who was born with a silver spoon in her mouth and threw it all away for her selfish desires. This is the home that once belonged to the von Richthofen family, one of the most influential, successful, and seemingly happy families in all of Sao Paulo, Brazil. The patriarch of the family, Manfred Albert von Richthofen, grew up in Germany and later went on to attend college in Sao Paulo for civil engineering in the 1970s. While he was drowning in textbooks and essays, a fellow student at the college caught his eye. Mauricia was the same age as him, but so wildly different. Of Lebanese and Italian descent, she had grown up in Sao Paulo and seemed to have the vibrant culture of the city ingrained in her. She was loud, funny, colorful, and vivacious. Manfred was quiet and reserved, but Mauricia didn't mind in the least. The moment she laid her eyes on him, she was in love. They quickly got married and began their careers in earnest. Manfred went on to work as an engineer for the massive highway system surrounding Sao Paulo, a position that offered him stability as well as financial success. In his career, he saw through many successful projects and worked as the head engineer on the Murdér Beltway project. True to their opposites attract personas, Mauricia was in a completely different field, working as a successful psychiatrist for patients who adored her understanding and well-placed humor. But no success felt greater to them than the birth of their child. Suzane was born on September 3rd, 1983, and her brother Andreas was born a few years after her. They were raised in this beautiful house with a pool, garden, library, their own bedrooms, and whatever they wanted for toys, food, and creature comforts inside. When you consider the wealth disparity in Sao Paulo, that really illustrates just how lucky Andreas and Suzane were to grow up the way they did. It's estimated that 19% of Sao Paulo lives in extreme poverty, with a third of citizens in slum-like conditions. In 2021, the average income of Sao Paulo was around $24,000, less than half of the lowest average state income in the US. In other words, Andreas and Suzane could have been raised in a much more emotionally, mentally, and physically draining situation. But instead, they had pools to swim in, parents who loved them and pushed them to pursue what they loved, and an education at one of the top schools in the city. Suzane attended a German language school with extremely high expectations and flourished there, passing tests with ease. By the time she was 18, she was fluent in 3 languages and well on a path for a successful life. And it wasn't just because of her education or the love of her parents. It was because there was close to $10 million sitting in a Swiss bank account with her name on it. Her parents told her that if she graduated school and successfully made a name for herself, all of the money in the account would be granted to her to do as she pleased. All Suzane had to do to continue living her life of luxury was to graduate from law school, land any job, even if just for a few days, and then buy herself a lavish home and relax for the rest of her life. But in the summer of 1999, something came up that she couldn't ignore, and it became much more important than her education. In August, the von Richthofen family went to a local park to enjoy a model aircraft fair. Much like his father, Andreas had fostered a deep love of engineering, and he was passionate about model planes. Ever present, encouraging parents, Mauricia and Manfred brought him to the festival to encourage his interest in aviation and mechanics. Uninterested, Suzane went elsewhere for the day. But what happened at that fair would change her life forever. Andreas became enamored with the model planes created by a local 19-year-old, Daniel Cravinhos de Paulo e Silva. A car and motorcycle repairman by trade, Daniel knew his way around any machinery you could throw at him. In his time off of work at a local garage, he fell in love with model planes and quickly became one of the most talented crafters and flyers around. Immediately, Andreas took an interest in him. A couple of years his senior, Daniel seemed like the kind of person Andreas wanted to grow into. Sadly, he was far from it. After spending the majority of the day with Daniel, Andreas asked Daniel if he would be interested in teaching him how to craft better planes. His parents agreed to compensate Daniel handsomely for helping out their son. And like that, a new dream was created for Andreas, who quickly began working with Daniel every chance that he got. The von Richthofens were thrilled to have brought some joy and education into their son's life. They had no idea, however, what terror they were inviting into their home. Daniel would frequently come to the von Richthofen estate to work on planes, and it wasn't long after he started having these lessons that something else caught his eye. One afternoon, while he was building planes with Andreas, Daniel was introduced to Suzanne. By all accounts, the two teens couldn't have possibly been more different. Like her father, Suzanne was said to be calm, understated, and quiet. She didn't stick out in a crowd, didn't challenge authority, and tended to follow the rules. As far as her parents knew, at least. Daniel, on the other hand, was known to be loud, funny, and at times fiery. While Suzanne had grown up with a silver spoon in her mouth, Daniel had nothing to his name but grease on his hands and a head full of ideas. At a young age, Daniel was forced to drop out of school in order to help support both himself and his family. He took to working in a garage with his older brother Christian, repairing motorcycles and cars. Their long days didn't pay well, but it was enough to keep a roof over Daniel's head and food in his stomach. The two ended up taking jiu-jitsu classes together, which strengthened their relationship, and slowly but surely, they became an inclusive couple. To Suzanne's parents, it was an odd pairing, but they didn't disapprove. After all, Daniel was a close friend with Andreas. He knew the family, and he'd always treated them with respect. He told Manfred and Maricia that he was attending law school with hopes of being the first in his family to move up the corporate ladder. But as time passed, so did the family's affection for Daniel. The man they had believed was a hardworking person who came from the harsh side of town had morphed into something they weren't expecting. He was spending all of his time with Suzanne, living a life of luxury off their dime. He quit his job at the garage, didn't sign up for university, and took to smoking and doing drugs all hours of the day. Suzanne's parents watched as Suzanne, too, began to slip down that unsavory path. Manfred and Maricia told Suzanne that they no longer approved of her relationship with Daniel. Protesting their rejection, she begged for her father to pay for her and Daniel to get an apartment together and get the space they needed. Her father welcomed the idea, but with a catch. If Suzanne was going to move out with Daniel, then she needed to fully financially support them. There would be no more of her father's money to fund her derailing lifestyle. Instead, Suzanne opted to stay home, but she wasn't willing to give up Daniel that easily. Because Andreas was such good friends with Daniel and liked seeing Suzanne happy, he helped hide their relationship from their parents. Often, this entailed Daniel coming up with lies to excuse his sister's absence late at night or early in the morning. With Daniel backing up any claim she made, it's likely that her parents didn't suspect Suzanne was lying to them at all. That is, until they decided to go on vacation. Soon after Suzanne turned 18, her parents took a month-long vacation to Europe. They intended to visit where Manfred had grown up and beyond, visiting relatives and seeing all the glorious sights the continent has to offer. And back at home, Suzanne was set on seeing how much fun her home had to offer. She and Daniel began throwing pool parties in the courtyard. Pool parties that weren't just dancing and drinking, but hazy nights of drug use. One night blurred into the other, with Daniel and Suzanne at the helm. When Manfred and Maricia returned from their trip, they immediately heard what had been happening at their home from neighbors and family friends. In an instant, their trust in their daughter snapped, and at the time of their deaths, it had never recovered. Manfred put pressure on Suzanne, urging her to get serious about making a life for herself. If she didn't start making changes, he told her he was going to consider taking her allowance away, leaving her penniless. To this day, it's argued how much effect that had on what happened next. In the early morning hours, just after 4 a.m., a bone-chilling, blood-curdling scream shook the neighborhood around the von Richthofen home awake. Suzanne and Andreas stumbled out of the front door, ghost-white looks on their faces. The two told law enforcement that they had snuck out Halloween night at around 9 p.m., soon after their parents went to bed after a long day of work. Andreas went to a party at a local internet cafe. Meanwhile, Suzanne claimed that she went to a love hotel, intending on spending a couple of romantic hours with Daniel. When they returned home, their parents' bedroom door was wide open. Both Manfred and Maricia lay in the bloody sheets in a horribly graphic state. They had been attacked in their sleep with crowbars and beaten until they were nearly unrecognizable. The beating that they had endured was savage, and sadly, they survived for quite some time. Suzanne was discovered with a plastic bag over her head that had ultimately been used to asphyxiate her. Both of them had been strangled with towels. At first, the scene looked like a terrible robbery that the kids were lucky to avoid. But, as law enforcement looked closer, troubling signs began to emerge. Firstly, the security guard who worked for the family and lived in the guardhouse just across the street hadn't been notified of anyone entering the home. The only way to enter the house without triggering the alarm was to enter the correct code into the access pad. That meant that whoever had entered the home to commit the murder knew the code. Soon after this, the security system was disabled, allowing anyone to walk into the home without setting off any warnings. Across the street, the guard was fast asleep, unaware of what was about to befall the family he had cared for diligently for years. Then, there was the inconsistency with the robbery. Money had indeed been stolen from the property, but there were things of immense value that hadn't been touched. Jewelry and electronics were left behind. Drawers were opened in several rooms, and papers were strewn about. Papers that seemed to have been placed a little too intentionally on the carpet. Everything about the robbery was too uniform and controlled to feel authentic. And everything about Suzane's behavior felt the same to investigators. At the scene, she was cold, seemingly unbothered and unsurprised by the horror of what she had seen. Meanwhile, poor Andreas was hyperventilating and struggling to breathe so badly that he could barely stand. For almost the entire day, he was stuck in a spiral of anxiety and grief that left him a shell of his former self. These waves of panic and PTSD continued to follow him years after the horrible situation he was forced to see. Naturally, law enforcement took Suzane and Andreas in for questioning. They told matching stories and were let go, looked at by the public as grieving children more than suspects. On November 1st, 2002, Manfred and Mauricia were laid to rest to be beside each other for all of eternity. At the funeral, Suzane seemed numb and Andreas was clearly heartbroken. However, it wasn't her lack of reaction at the funeral that struck people as odd. It was her behavior surrounding the days after her parents' death. Apparently just 3 days after her parents were murdered, Suzane threw a pool party at the home. Many people were appalled by this behavior, questioning how a supposedly grieving teenager could party in the wake of her parents' brutal deaths. The public perception of Suzane began to wane. She seemed to be living her best life after the death of her parents, while Andreas was struggling immensely. Finally, a local had enough and came forward to police with information that they felt was vital to the investigation. They reported that someone had come to their motorcycle shop and purchased a Suzuki CGSX in $100 bills. The bike was incredibly expensive, and the person who purchased the bike had no means of having so much money to throw around. The buyer was Christian, Daniel's older brother. At the time, he still worked at the motorcycle shop, and he was known to spend the majority of the money he earned on drugs and booze. So, how had he suddenly come up with the money to buy a brand new bike outright? Law enforcement brought Christian in for questioning. Though he had a tougher exterior and reputation within the local community, it only took a few questions before he cracked and blurted out the truth to the police. He had killed Mauricia and Manfred, but he didn't do it alone. For months, Suzane and Daniel had been plotting the murder of Manfred and Mauricia. With the promise of financial gain, Christian was quick to agree and take part in ending their lives. On Halloween night, Suzane did sneak out with Andreas. However, after she dropped him off at the internet cafe, she returned home with Daniel and Christian. She entered the house using the code, then disabled the alarm system from inside. She watched as Christian and Daniel slid on surgical gloves and wrapped their hands around iron crowbars. She remained downstairs while the boys made the journey up to her parents' bedroom while they were peacefully sleeping. Though she wasn't present in the room, many argue that she is just as guilty as Christian and Daniel. In the room, the two began to viciously beat the sleeping couple with crowbars, but shockingly, they refused to die. In a pool of blood, the two continued to gasp for breath and even attempted to fight back. The boys took towels and tightened them around their necks, strangling them. Tragically, Manfred did not survive this, taking his last breath as one of the boys choked him. But Mauricia was still fighting for her life. Apparently believing that they had no other option, the boys grabbed a plastic bag and wrapped it around her head, fatally suffocating her. After, the three ran around the house, taking money and staging the scene to look like a robbery gone wrong. When they left the scene of the crime, Suzane and Daniel went to a love hotel. Christian went to a local fast food joint, trying to ensure that he was seen in public to give himself an alibi for the night. Soon after Christian's confession, Daniel and Suzane also confessed to law enforcement. However, their stories differed. Daniel told law enforcement that the murder was driven by money and that he couldn't resist the opportunity after growing up in poverty. Suzane, however, reportedly denied that money was a motive at all. The brothers both claimed that Suzane's family was highly violent and treated Suzane and Andreas cruelly. They stated that they simply acted on her wishes, wanting to rescue her from her life. After their initial arrest, three were allowed to walk free while they awaited their trial. During that time period, it seemed that Suzane was set on making herself look innocent. Early on, she gave an interview to a local news station, but it did the opposite of what she intended. Unbeknownst to her, a camera was rolling while her lawyer coached her on what to say and how to act on camera. Then, she did exactly as he said, faking tears.
Sobre o que falar do ex-namorado Daniel Cravinhos e como se comportar diante da câmera.
Acabou, mais nada. Começa a chorar e fala, não quero falar mais. O que ele mandava, o que ele mandava sempre dizendo que se eu amasse era para fazer. E eu, pelo amor de Deus, não quero mais tocar nesse assunto que me faz muito mal. Chega.
Eu não quero, por favor. Nossa, ontem eu fiquei super ruim, foi super. Eu passei muito mal de noite. Por favor.
Naturally, the public's perception of Suzanne and her innocence plummeted after this incident. 4 years after the violent crime took place, Suzanne, Daniel, and Christian were brought to trial. Each of them brought their own strategies to court in an attempt to lower their sentences. Suzanne tried to blame the entire situation on Daniel, stating in tears that he kept her on several drugs in an attempt to keep her out of her mind and under his control. The brothers continued to claim that Suzanne was the mastermind behind the murder. All three were initially charged with the same crime, first-degree murder. Suzanne was sentenced to 40 years in prison for first-degree murder. Daniel received the same sentence, while his brother received 38 years for conspiracy. However, none of them served their full sentences. Both Daniel and Christian have been released. While Daniel has flown mostly under the radar, Christian has returned to working in a motorcycle repair shop. Suzanne was released in January of 2023 on probation and has since gone on to move to the community of Atibaia, where she has settled down and given birth to a son with her domestic partner. In addition, she has caused outrage for returning to law school and working towards a degree that will allow her to work in the criminal justice system. In September of 2024, citizens of Sao Paulo were outraged when they discovered that she had applied to work as a clerk in the Justice Department. There are no laws that would prohibit her from taking this role, which means that a woman who orchestrated the murder of her parents may be working in the office that separates right from wrong.